Bibliophiles of the internet, my name is Audrey, and today I'm here to recommend some books. Pretty straightforward, right? This video is actually part of a tour stop on behalf of Colored Pages to celebrate Each of Us a Desert by Mark Oshiro, which is a book I have read and loved. So today I'm here to recommend some books you should read if you also enjoy Each of Us a Desert. To contextualize these recommendations, my first recommendation is obviously for Each of Us a Desert by Mark Oshiro, which comes out on September 15th from Tor Teen. It's an Ownvoices queer Latinx high fantasy story about Xochitl, who is a cuentista, and in this world, cuentistas have magic that allows them to literally take other people's stories into their bodies, and her job is to complete this healing ritual by releasing their stories back to the desert and to their god Solis. It's important work, but it quickly becomes a burden for Xochi, and her village is also being run by a vicious tyrant. So she gets tangled up with the tyrant's daughter, ironically, and the two of them plan to escape together into the desert. Like I said in my July wrap-up, Each of Us a Desert is a story that calls us to recognize that forgetting is not the same thing as healing, and that the space we hold for other people is just as important as the space we have to hold for ourselves. It's about Xochi desperately trying to find another way of life and trying to make sense of this belief system that's always been presented to her as obvious and self-evident. It's a life where there's no room for questions or even for her own existence. So it's very much about challenging those traditions, trying to forge your own path, and finding out that there is no one correct way to exist. Each of Us a Desert is a slow burn, magical fantasy story that takes you on an epic journey across the desert. It's full of Spanish and poetry and survival and beauty. It's sapphic. It's just full of great stuff. So yeah, if any of that appeals to you, then you should definitely pick up Each of Us a Desert because it's a truly fantastic book. And now that you know what the story is about, my recommendations will hopefully make sense. The first book I want to recommend is not going to be a surprise because I also mentioned it in my July wrap-up, and that is The Deep by River Solomon, David Diggs, William Hudson, and Jonathan Snipes. The Deep is this really wonderful Ownvoices queer SFF novella about the society of merpeople who actually evolved from the bodies of enslaved African women who were tossed overboard from slave ships. Their collective history is obviously very traumatic, so much so that their bodies literally cannot contain those memories on a day-to-day basis. So housing those memories falls to the historian, who preserves and embodies those memories while everyone else forgets. Obviously, this is an incredibly lonely and painful job, so Yetu, who is the historian in this case, plans her escape to the surface where she will come face to face with the truth about her people's past. I think the connections here are pretty obvious. Just like Xochi takes on the stories of her neighbors and fellow villagers, Yetu has to take on the memories of her people, and for both of those characters, it takes a very literal toll on their bodies and shows how pain has a physical weight and consequence. Yetu is also incredibly burdened with this responsibility and longs to find a way that she can live for herself and stop suffering in silence. It's a story about collective cooperation and confronting past trauma to take away its power, and I think the solutions to those problems presented in The Deep are nothing short of brilliant. So if the magic of taking on other people's stories is something that appeals to you about Each of Us a Desert, The Deep is the perfect literary companion in that sense. Next, I would like to recommend The Grief Keeper by Alexandra Villasante. Shout out to Shannon from That's So Po for drawing this connection for me. I think it's a really great comparison. This is an Ownvoices queer Latinx contemporary story about Marisol, who's with her younger sister when they're caught illegally crossing the border from El Salvador to the United States. The two of them are basically on their own and desperate to survive, which is why Marisol jumps at the opportunity to secure their asylum request in exchange for being part of this experimental government program that allows people to physically take on other people's grief and trauma into their bodies. If the experiment fails, she and her sister will be sent back to El Salvador, which for Marisol as a young queer teenager could very much be a death sentence. Among many things, The Grief Keeper is an extraordinary commentary on how we systematically strip away immigrants' choices and rights, and how we foist unwanted, unsafe, undesirable labor onto immigrants and expect them to be grateful for the opportunity to contribute. And it also speaks to how Latinx immigrants are expected to carry other people's trauma within themselves intergenerationally without ever getting the chance to heal, because they're constantly having to fight for their right to safety and existence. So again, I think the parallels of Xochi taking on people's stories and hurting because of it are pretty obvious with Marisol's situation, and both stories challenge this idea that protecting ourselves means going through the hard stuff alone, because it doesn't. My next recommendation is for We Set the Dark on Fire by Taylor K. Maija. It's the first book in an Ownvoices queer Latinx dystopian duology about Danielle Vargas, who is graduating at the top of her class from the Medio School for Girls, where young women are trained to either run their husband's household or produce and raise their kids. This is her way of distancing herself from the lower class class because these are often advantageous marriages within very powerful families, but Daniela's future depends on no one discovering her deepest, darkest secret, which is that her identification papers are fake. Dani thinks she's in the clear until she gets tapped by a rebel group who knows her secret and who want to enlist her in the resistance. This is very different from Each of Us a Desert. It's definitely not a one-to-one comparison by any means, but I think the two stories do share quite a few base elements. As you can tell from the synopsis, We Set the Dark on Fire is also a high-stakes queer Latinx fantasy type story. It has a delicious enemies to lovers sapphic storyline as well, and it's also about challenging this very dangerous, harmful system of power currently in place. In Each of Us a Desert, I feel like Xochi is trying to find her place in the world and find a way to define herself outside of the constraints her village has put on her shoulders, and I think Dani's involvement in this rebellion is also allowing her to do the same thing. So if the life and death survival scenario and high stakes of Each of Us a Desert appeals to you, I think We Set the Dark on Fire would be another perfect follow-up book. Another Latinx book I would put in conversation with Each of Us a Desert is Wild Beauty by Anna Marie McLemore. It's an Ownvoices queer Latinx magical realism story about the Nomeavides family, who are made up entirely of women, and they have spent generation after generation tending to this estate known as La Pradera with their magical ability to grow plants and flowers from their bodies. There's also a curse placed on the women in this family where if they fall in love with someone or love too strongly, that person will vanish completely and never be heard from again. After living in fear and shame for so many years, suddenly a mysterious boy is surrendered from the earth, and the Nomeavides women are left to figure out how exactly he fits into their past. Again, this is not like a perfect one-to-one comparison because these stories are very different, but on the one hand, if you want another queer Latinx story that's slow and magical and lyrical, this is definitely that. But Wild Beauty also in its own way explores the phenomenon of forgetting and memory, which I think is very intrinsic to Latinx culture itself, and even the name Nomeavides is just a play on the Spanish phrase that literally translates to "do not forget me," which I will be forever mad about because it's so freaking smart. And I think the story really speaks to how we in Latinx communities are sometimes complicit in burying our own history, our trauma, our past. And because of the magical realism element, we get to see that in a very literal sense. I think it also parallels with Each of Us a Desert in the sense that Xochi feels trapped by this agreed upon destiny, this preordained fate she feels like she can't escape. And the Nomeavides women feel just as helpless when it comes to this haunting intergenerational curse. And in that sense, both stories are about characters trying to outrun what they've always believed about themselves, what they've always believed to be their destiny, wanting to break those cycles once and for all, and really searching for a new way to exist. The last book I want to mention is not a recommendation, but rather a suggestion, and the distinction there is that I'm suggesting a book I have not read, so I cannot personally recommend it, but I feel like plot-wise and thematically, this is a very similar story that was worth mentioning for posterity's sake, and that book is Beast Made of Night by Tochi Onyenbuchi. It's an Ownvoices YA fantasy that takes place in a world known as Kos, where mages can actually separate sin from sinner in the form of sin beasts that are created from strong feelings of guilt. The main character is Taj, who is a young sin eater indentured by mages to slay sin beasts, and when he kills them, a tattoo of the beast appears on his skin, and the memory and guilt of actually committing the sin appears in his mind. One day, Taj is called to eat the sin of a royal, and he is thrust into a conspiracy threatening to destroy the world as he knows it. I actually heard about this from Nkatha during Quarantine Pages, and it stood out to me as being similar to Each of Us a Desert in the sense that you have a character who, again, is physically taking on someone else's pain and internalizing the experience of it in a very literal sense. This story sounds like it has that added element of action in the sense that the sins actually become monsters that the main character has to fight, but I still think they're very similar because Xochi is expected to shoulder people's stories full of shame, and sometimes those stories are even considered to be sins or secrets. It seems like both stories explore the physical and traumatic consequences of taking responsibility for someone else's pain, so if that is something you want to read even more about, you may want to try Beast Made of Night. So those are all the recommendations and suggestions I had for you today. Once again, I was really blown away by Each of Us a Desert, and I think Mark Oshiro is way more talented than they have any business being, but while I think you should check out all of these books, if nothing else, you should definitely check out their upcoming book. If you have any recommendations for me based on any of the themes or elements in Each of Us a Desert, definitely let me know down below in the comments. But that's everything I had to recommend today. Until next time, educate yourself, be kind to yourself, take care of yourself, and I will catch you on the flip side of the page.